The Night Watchman. Jake had always thought the worst part of working security at the Riverside Storage Complex was the boredom. 12 hours alone in a maze of concrete corridors and metal doors, nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the highway for company. But after 3 weeks on the night shift, he realized he'd been wrong. The worst part was the voices. It started during his first week in Section D, the older part of the facility that had been renovated after a fire 5 years ago. The insurance company had done a good job fixing the damage, but something about that section felt different. The air was staler there, the shadows deeper, and the silence more oppressive. "Just do your rounds every hour," the day shift supervisor Carlos had told him while handing over the keys. "Section D is mostly long-term storage. People rent those units and forget about them for years. You won't have any trouble." The first few nights went smoothly. Jake walked the corridors with his flashlight, checking doors, making sure the locks were secure. Most units had been sealed for months, even years, collecting dust and memories in equal measure. Then, at 3:17 a.m. on his fourth night, he heard the first voice. "Help me." A weak, muffled sound coming from somewhere near Unit 47. Jake stopped in his tracks. The voice was faint but clear, definitely human. He checked his radio, thinking maybe someone was breaking in, but the static was normal. He walked toward Unit 47, pressing his ear to the metal door. "Hello? Is someone in there?" Silence. Jake checked the lock. Secure. The unit had been rented by someone named Margaret Webb 3 years ago, and according to the computer, she'd paid in advance for 5 years. No recent activity on the account. He made a note in his log and continued his patrol. But an hour later, the voice came again, this time from Unit 23. "Please, somebody help me." Same weak, desperate tone. Different location. Jake checked Unit 23. Also locked tight, rented by Thomas Rodriguez in 2019. Also paid up front. By the end of the week, Jake had heard voices from 3 different units in Section D. Always the same plea for help, always from spaces sealed for years. He started bringing a digital recorder, but when he played back the recordings, there were no voices, just his own footsteps and responses to conversations only he could hear. "Carlos," he said after his shift, "has anyone ever complained about sounds coming from the old units in Section D?" The supervisor looked at him strangely. "Sounds? Like what?" "Voices. People calling for help." Carlos laughed. "Kid, those units have been sealed for years. Some of them haven't been opened since before the fire. What you're hearing is probably the building settling, or maybe mice. Old buildings make all kinds of noises." But Jake knew it wasn't mice. The voices were becoming clearer each night, and he was starting to make out more than just cries for help. "I can't breathe in here. How long have I been trapped? Why won't anyone come? The smoke. There's so much smoke." That last one made Jake stop cold. He started researching the fire that had damaged Section D. According to news reports from 2019, the blaze had started in a maintenance room and spread quickly through the storage corridors. The building had been evacuated, but by the time firefighters contained the flames, significant damage had been done to dozens of units. What the reports didn't mention was whether anyone had been inside the storage units when the fire started. Jake began researching the people who rented the units where he heard voices. Margaret Webb, Thomas Rodriguez, Sarah Chen. All had rented their units in the months leading up to the fire. All had paid for extended terms in advance. None of them had been seen since the fire. The breakthrough came when Jake looked up Margaret Webb online. Her social media accounts had gone silent in October 2019, right around the time of the fire. The last post was about clearing out her late mother's house. "Just until I can figure out what to keep," she'd written. "There's so much stuff, I might just sleep in the storage unit tonight instead of driving home. LOL. Jake's blood turned cold. He researched the others and found similar patterns. people who had been secretly living in their units when the fire hit. Jake realized with growing horror that these people had been living in their units when the fire hit. The smoke had overcome them before they could escape. But if they died in the fire, why weren't there any bodies found? The insurance files revealed the truth. The investigation had been rushed, and several units had been declared total losses and sealed without being searched. The people weren't just dead, they were entombed. That night, Jake brought bolt cutters. He started with Unit 47. The lock cut easily and the door rolled up with a screech. The smell hit him first: smoke, ash, and something sweetly artificial. Inside was a makeshift apartment, and in the corner sat what remained of Margaret Webb. The fire suppression system had preserved her body in a cocoon of chemicals, mummified by flame retardant and lack of oxygen. She sat in a camping chair, facing the door, as if waiting for someone to find her. Jake found similar scenes in the other units. People who had made homes in storage spaces, preserved by the chemical fire suppressant system. But they weren't at rest. "You found us." Margaret's voice was clearer now, coming from right behind Jake as he stood in her unit. He turned, but saw only her preserved remains. "We've been calling for so long." "How long have you been aware?" Jake whispered. "Since the smoke cleared. We're trapped between being alive and being dead. The chemicals, they kept our bodies, but something else kept our minds." Jake learned that the fire suppression system used an experimental chemical compound, something that interfered with the natural process of death. The victims had died from smoke inhalation, but the preservative had maintained just enough brain activity to keep their consciousness trapped in their lifeless bodies. For 5 years, they had been aware, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to die completely. Only when someone came close could they project their voices, begging for release. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked. "Set us free," Thomas Rodriguez spoke from Unit 23. "Break the seals. Let us finish dying." Jake spent the next week opening the 3 units, documenting everything, then calling the police. The investigation made headlines. 3 missing people found preserved in storage units, victims of corporate negligence. But Jake kept the supernatural aspects to himself. How could he explain that the dead had been conscious all along? The night after the bodies were removed, Jake did his final rounds of Section D. The corridor was silent, but as he reached the end of the hall, he heard whispers. "Thank you." Jake quit his job the next day. He couldn't work security anymore, knowing that there might be other places where the dead were trapped, calling out to anyone willing to listen. He became a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases. And sometimes, late at night, he still hears voices, not from storage units, but from abandoned buildings, forgotten basements, sealed rooms where people might have died alone and unnoticed. He always listens. He always investigates. Because sometimes the dead aren't haunting the living. They're just asking for help finishing what should have ended years ago. And Jake has learned that the most terrifying thing isn't being dead. It's being dead and still being aware of it.